Okay, the next theory of personality is the trait theory. The trait theory basically says that we all have traits, and all of these traits are applied to every single person. And what makes us who we are is the amount of that trait so that we each have. So a trait is defined as a tendency to respond in a certain way to many different kinds of situations. Basically, it's looking at how are you going to behave in a certain situation? What behaviors go together? What can we predict about your behavior because of your personality? So you will act a certain way in a situation because of a certain trait. Make sense? So Gordon Allport was kind of one of the leading psychologists in trait theory. He described personality in terms of fundamental traits, um, characteristics or characteristic patterns of behavior for us to act in a certain way. And he gave us three types of traits: cardinal, central, and secondary. Cardinal traits are characteristics or features so important that you can identify by it. So, for example, Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, he can be identified as stingy and cold-hearted. So that characteristic is so important about that person that we can identify with that. Okay. The next one is a central trait. Central traits are making us predictable in a certain situation or in most situations. So she's a flirt, he's shy. Those are central traits. And then finally, secondary traits are the least important of the three, but give our preference towards certain things. So music or food. So I like country music or I like Chinese food. Cattell came along and used statistics or factor analysis to identify 16 different personality factors. He believed that each of these personality factors made up people. Okay, so everyone had all 16 of these characteristics. We just all have them in different varying degrees. Okay, and which degree you have of each factor would determine your personality. Eysenck came along and they decided that personality can be rated on two different dimensions. The first is the extroversion versus introversion dimension. Extroversion is, you're extroverted, socially outgoing, active, and lively. Introversion is thoughtful, reserved, or quiet. And then the other dimension is emotional stability versus instability. So stability is easygoing, you're relaxed, well-adjusted, even-tempered. Emotional instability would be you're moody, anxious, and restless. And what they determined is that we have our personality based on all of these dimensions, right? So you can be emotionally unstable and extroverted. And then these are going to be your traits that you have. You can be emotionally unstable and introverted. And then these are your traits. So that's kind of like what they came up with. And then there were four major categories. So melancholic, choleric, phlegmatic, and sanguine. Okay, big five. So the big five theory is probably the most important of the trait theories that you're going to need to know. It is by far the most accepted trait theory in psychology right now about personality. So trait theory, most accepted trait theory. Basically what this says is that traits are rated on a continuum. And there are five major continuums that we are all rated upon. So these factors are expanded from Eysenck, so they kind of started there and then they expanded them. This theory is not one person who came up with the big five trait theory. It's kind of a combination of everyone's put together. So let's talk about the different continuums, the big five continuums that they have. So the first is the emotional stability. This identifies individuals who experience things relatively easily and without getting upset. So if you're highly emotionally stable, you kind of go with the flow. You don't really get upset too easily. The opposite of that is neuroticism, and this is someone who is constantly angry or worried. They complain all the time. They look for the bad rather than the good. The next trait would be extroversion. So again, these are very close to Eysenck's 2 dimensions, right? Those first two. So emotional stability and then extroversion. Extroversion is associated with warmth, talkativeness, and being energetic. The opposite is obviously introversion, and this person is quiet, shy, and cautious. Next is agreeableness. This is sympathetic, cooperative, kind, trusting, and good natured. The opposite is antagonism. You're abrasive, irritable, suspicious, jealous. The next is openness to experience. This describes people who are open-minded and willing to try intellectual experiences, new ideas, or creative experiences. The opposite end of the spectrum for this is resistance to new experience, being predictable, conforming, or unimaginative. And then finally, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness are people who are dutiful, dedicated, responsible, organized. And then the opposite is impulsiveness, someone who is careless or giving up easily or being irresponsible. Now, it's important to note for all 5 of these traits that I talked about, the bold term on the top is kind of one end of the spectrum, and the opposite is the other end. Most trait psychologists believe that no one is one fully or the other, right? Like we lie somewhere in between these 2 extremes. And it's a spectrum, so you can be a little bit over here or a little bit over there. So that's kind of what trait theorists believes. You're not like 100% conscientious or 100% impulsive. Make sense? Okay, so let's assess this. So how do we determine whether or not where someone is on this spectrum? Well, Paul Costa and Robert McCrae came up with the revised NEO personality inventory. And basically what this is it's 240 questions, and you answer them. Most of these are going to be those questions like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How strongly do you agree? How strongly do you disagree? That kind of thing. And based on your answers to these questions, we can look at a key and then determine where you fall on a certain trait. These personality inventories are questionnaires, like I said, and you respond to a wide variety of different questions. Usually it has to do with your behaviors and your feelings about things. And these are really different from those projective tests, right? Because these are clear questions and answers, and there's a key to determine meaning from it. So it's a very objective test. The most used test is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, the MMPI. And this one is used to identify abnormal personality traits. So this is going to be used in therapy a lot of times or with a psychologist to determine whether or not you are abnormal in your personality, meaning you are maybe depressed or you are too impulsive, have a lot of anxiety, that kind of thing. So this is scored very objectively. However, this does not always mean validity. So because it's objective, we know that it's testing, we're getting the correct test, but people learn how to fool the test. So you can have you ever taken one of these personality inventories for like a job or for college or something like that where it asks you, how would you react in this situation? And you're like, well, I want to get the job, so I definitely want to answer however they're going to want me to answer it, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean we get a true visual of how someone would be, okay? You're going to take one of these personality inventories later on in the unit in class. So you'll kind of get to see how they work and you'll understand that while these are objective, you definitely can fool it to make it seem like you're one way or another. Okay, so let's criticize this theory a little bit. Traits, while we all have them, do they determine our behavior in every single situation? No. Yes, traits do seem to remain pretty constant over time. Shyness. Like if you're shy when you're young, you're probably going to be shy when you're older too. They're pretty constant. However, our behaviors can change and they do change. we're not predictable in every single situation, right? So if you are very impulsive in one situation, you could be not quite as impulsive in the other. Overall, your average personality is pretty predictable. However, some situations might give you a different um, trait that is stronger than another.